Welcome to Disruption Dialogues Podcast Season 2. Listen to the influential leaders and trailblazers from around the world as they share invaluable insights to navigating the fifth industrial revolution.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Disruption Dialogues Season 2. I'm Robert Outram, Vice President for Chemicals, Materials and Food for the Europe, Middle East region at Markets and Markets. Today I'm in conversation with Leo Clancy, Chief Executive Officer at Enterprise Ireland. As the CEO of Enterprise Ireland, Leo manages a workforce of over 800 professionals, directing their efforts towards enhancing Irish business growth. With a career spanning 2 decades in technology, engineering and investment, Leo demonstrates prowess in nurturing client relationships, enabling worldwide expansion. Leo's past involvement in spearheading the tech sector at IDA further bolsters Irish enterprises' triumphs through strategic utilisation of a global network. Okay, today's focus revolves around a compelling topic, which is the future of trade. So Leo, first topic I'd like to discuss is around onshoring and offshoring. We've seen that due to the COVID and the China supply situation, as well as this recent war in Ukraine, there's been a lot of discussion around energy security, supply chain security in Europe and other parts of the world. There's been a lot of talk about onshoring or reshoring activity. Do you see businesses reshoring back to Europe or Ireland?
Yeah, well, Robert, first of all, thanks for having me on. Delighted to be here with Markets and Markets, and looking forward to the conversation today. So, onshoring, we've definitely seen some evidence of supply chain being moved back to Ireland and to Europe more broadly. I think it's for a number of reasons. Supply chain resilience and multi-sourcing from a risk point of view became a strong factor during COVID, I think, for a lot of countries in terms of the risk it represented. And that was probably exacerbated by the terrible war in Ukraine over the last year. We also saw, though, that during COVID in particular, the cost of shipping became a critical factor. So even some of the reverberations of that include if people were shipping, for instance, large plastic components that take up a lot of space but don't weigh very much, the choice about whether you injection mold those closer to home versus transport them on containers became very real for a lot of people, and that's interesting. And I think combined with that, certainly among our clients, we support 4,000 Irish companies who are exporting around the world. A lot of them are implementing ERP now, and you might think companies of all sizes have had ERP for a long time, but small to mid-sized manufacturers, it hasn't been the norm that they would have a sophisticated ERP system. So we're seeing companies be in more control of things like their sourcing supply chain, the level of diversity they have, the cost of components that arise within their supply chain. So people are getting better through digitalization of their supply chains and their ERP at managing those. Sustainability, huge concern. Product miles are material now to people's overall carbon footprint to their product. I think that is, and I know we'll talk about this later, that's a topic that's not going away. And then automation last, so long-winded answer, but automation last has the dual effect of making volume labor less of a variable and high-skilled labor more of a decision factor. So you do see that countries that would have been typically high cost in a highly automated environment may be more attractive than economies that are traditionally low cost. And then that means that the capital cost of making an investment is relatively similar between jurisdictions because the equipment and building is going to cost you the same. So labor becomes the only variable. As that reduces, it becomes less of a consideration. So all that said, though, some evidence that all those factors are causing reshoring, but it's not a huge ripping change that we're seeing through supply chains for our clients. It's measured, it's tactical, and it's dependent on the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. We'll come on to digitalization and automation, some of these major things that are going to potentially enable reshoring later in the discussion. I wonder what your opinion was on, how can businesses break away from being reliant on China? I mean, you've said yourself there hasn't been a huge rip away from, bringing things back to the shore. And China almost has a stranglehold to some extent on a lot of these industries. I mean, I work in the chemical industry, and they have that whole supply chain is in place, from the cracker all the way through making something like a polyester, all the way to making the textiles and then making the clothing at the end of it. And that whole supply chain is fully integrated. So it's very, very difficult to break away from that fully integrated model. How can businesses break away from that and start bringing stuff back into to Europe or other parts of the world?
Yeah, so I'm not, as I said, not seeing a panic about China, certainly among clients. The clients I speak to who have large manufacturing operations or sourcing in China are still very comfortable with China, despite the dialogue of recent months and the last
Right.
couple of years. I think there's a lot of comfort, lots of good relationships built up over time. So,
Yep.
so I don't think people are looking to break away. I think they are looking at opportunities though to diversify, because I think everyone's aware, because of the factors we spoke about a few minutes ago, of the challenge and risk of single supply. I think in certain industries like the ones you mentioned, those will be long-term changes, and there's also dependencies in there like energy cost. If you
Yep.
look at locations like Germany and Europe, that would have been probably the closest, or Italy, closest to those. Energy cost in Europe has been a huge factor, kind of disincentivizing some of those types of activity, becoming even higher volume in Europe in the last while. So I think it's a slow process, particularly in those deeply embedded and highly integrated supply chains. I think in the closer to final product stage, I think it's about multi-sourcing. We've seen a lot of clients move to other Asian locations close to China as a dual source arrangement for certain products, as we discussed earlier, moving all the way back to Europe. But that more because of supply chain challenges, costs, and sustainability and other concerns. So real mixed bag. No one's panicking as far as I'm seeing about being out of China, even in those markets you described, like the garment manufacturing and other areas. I don't know what you're seeing, but I don't see widespread panic, but I do see at least it's part of considerations all the time as to how we multi-source.
Right. Okay, and you mentioned energy costs as one thing. I'm just moving on to the future of trade as a topic. I mean, can it realistically be cost effective to produce domestically in places like Ireland? Energy cost is one thing, but you mentioned digitalization. Things like AI, automation. Is this now allowing domestic production to happen?
Yeah, and we've always had a very strong domestic production capability. It has shifted over time. We don't substantially have a garment manufacturing industry anymore, for instance, but we still produce by different measures. You can pick your metrics. Some people say that we produce enough food in a country of 5 million people to feed 35 million. So most of that and much of that processing is done in Ireland for those markets. It's done in a very efficient and high volume and low labor way as well. So for huge volumes of food material processed, there's actually very low labor content, high capital, and highly efficient process. Same is true in biopharma. We're one of the leading locations in the world for that, for medtech manufacturing. Semiconductor, there's very large plants from both Intel and Analog Devices here that have been upgraded over 30 to 50 years, depending on which plant we're talking about, and continue to be high volume. You have engineering businesses that serve those. So manufacturing is still a huge component of Irish business, but I would say that underlying trend of digitalization, automation, moving away from labor dependency as the key determining factor tends to be what determines whether manufacturing stays here. And again, that supply chain proximity to market piece is really important. Provenance kind of woven into that, and particularly in areas like food. I think it's great that Ireland has a reputation for having high quality standards and clear provenance. So I think manufacturing will remain strong. I think we'll get stronger across the world. Actually, I think as people look at the extreme strategic autonomy, but at the basic level, just proximity to market, lower cost, better access and knowledge and provenance, more manufacturing in more countries, I think will be the future.
Okay, great. And a bit of a broad question for you now, Leo, but how do you see world trade evolving over the next 20 years? I mean, for instance, we see in India, obviously a huge population there and potential demand there, but we see, companies struggling with very fragmented supply chains in countries like India. Uh, how do you see things panning out? Again, Africa, again, as another example, the potential there for things to take off. How do you see sort of world trade panning out or evolving over the next 20 years?
Yeah, I think maybe the first thing to recognize is we probably have had some of the most difficult trade tensions in the recent past with China, US, and the war in Ukraine, sanctions and related matters. That it's probably been a bit of a shock to the system in terms of what had been an increasingly open and collaborative trade environment. That said, though, it's in the context of 50 years of very strong growth in open trade and cooperation. So I think you can always expect these things. I think over time we'll see trade relationships normalize between jurisdictions and continue to grow. I think trends like sustainability will undoubtedly deeply affect trade. I think that's certainly going to be part of the future. Jurisdictions that let low carbon models be implemented and that can prove ethical approaches to sourcing and provenance, I think will have more success than others. In areas such as food, climate change will be a huge factor in reshaping trade, and we see locations, production capabilities, and sourcing demands adapt. So I think we'll continue to see trade grow. As you said, Africa, Asia will become much more integrated parts. India will be, I think, and is already with Apple's recent announcements and investments in India. It's a sign of what's to come, I think. A huge country, hugely well educated, great capability. I think India will be a much bigger part of global supply chains than it is now. Africa will evolve and become the population growth in Africa alone is going to stun the world system. And it'll be an interesting mix actually, because you're going to have an Africa that has much bigger population, much more demand for goods and services, particularly food, at the same time as we're seeing desertification in parts of Africa and life becoming much more difficult, frankly, for a lot of people, unfortunately. So that's going to affect, what kinds of products are traded, what's possible. I have a worry that places like sub-Saharan Africa may become more food trade dependent than being able to meet their own needs if the trends of climate change continue. So there's a huge amount of change that I think will come. I think if you lift it up a little bit, I think services will become a bigger component of trade over time. And I think some interesting new areas. So one that I'm intrigued about is energy trade. I think energy is going to be the fuel of business going forward. It always has been, but I think in a much more fundamental way, that being able to have energy security at the right price will be a huge factor in the future economy, particularly with electrification and trading of energy between jurisdictions. We're in Ireland just establishing a new interconnector to France directly. We have had one to the UK for the last more than 10 years. So that's it's going to continue to be a factor that countries will trade. Ireland has up to potentially 70 gigawatts of wind off our west coast. It's a huge wind resource in the northwest of Europe. We can only consume at the moment 6 gigawatts of that. So what do we do with the remaining 65 gigawatts? And does that become, can we trade that through interconnectors? That's a possibility that we can interconnect our electricity grid directly. Can we convert it to green hydrogen and ship that? That's another possibility. There are challenges with that. Or can we see that maybe more energy intensive manufacturing will come to the west coast of Ireland in proximity to that, and that the final goods will be shipped because that's a more efficient way. So I think some of these sub-trends will be fascinating in terms of what they mean to trade. But I think energy will be much more fundamental to future business than we're probably acknowledging.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And energy is a massive topic that we're looking at Markets and Markets. And you mentioned the hydrogen, for instance. I mean, that is going to revolutionize the whole energy industry once it finally gets going. And the key thing there is, obviously hydrogen being an explosive gas, transporting it expensive, which means and it can be produced locally at source. It makes a lot more sense to produce it at source and use it and consume it at source than to export it from the Middle East, for instance. So having that democratization of energy in the form of hydrogen is really going to shake up the whole system. But how you trade that, or the electricity from wind, is very, very interesting. Do you see any other hotspots of demand or hotspots of manufacturing? You mentioned some of these adjacent countries to China, for instance. I mean, we see, places like Bangladesh and evolving. Do you see any other areas, hotspots of demand or manufacturing?
Yeah, I think that's some of the first wave is, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Myanmar, even Malaysia. There's lots of manufacturing being established. I see that probably is the first reactive phase to diversification from China. I think in the medium term, India, very interesting, and I think there's been a big push by the Indian government around manufacturing and made in India. I think that's a really interesting trend. Africa, though, coming back to it, is going to be the hotspot of population growth and thereby consumption. I think volume manufacturing can and will grow closer to locations of consumption in general. So as populations grow in Africa and as the middle class hopefully continues to and grows in prosperity in India, I think that will be a big factor as well, because I just I think for volume goods and consumer goods in particular, they're usually heavy and frequently used. So being close to the point of consumption, I think, will be something that we're going to watch. I do believe high-tech products will continue to need very stable geopolitical regions and secure locations. You'll see more diversity than has existed so far. You look at companies like TSMC diversifying their supply chains off Taiwan, for instance. You can see some of that dialogue around semiconductor supply chains, but also what we saw during COVID and PPE debates. They're examples of what will lead to, I think, more considered approaches. But I think for high tech, the dependency on very skilled, probably long-standing labor forces that are used to producing very precise goods and have a lot of policy stability in the countries they operate in, I think that will continue to be a trend. And I think those countries that are already strong in high-tech manufacturing will continue to be chosen for those. So you'll see more diversification of those, but not on the scale of food and consumer goods. I think if I was producing if I was CEO of a semiconductor company or a biopharma company, I would probably want 2 or 3 locations that were assessed to be very robust geopolitically, each of them in my supply chain, to be able to sleep well at night.
Yeah. Okay. And companies have to sort of market themselves globally, and that is, of course, true of countries as well. Obviously, Enterprise Ireland, you're here to enable Irish companies to either export or to bring new business into Ireland. How can local government or agencies like yourself support businesses to make their regions competitive on the world scale with places like China, India, Bangladesh, etc.?
Yeah, I think it goes to stability and focus. I think policymakers, first of all, need to decide this is what they want. Ireland did this in the late 1950s, actually, a seminal paper by an economist who was also a senior civil servant called T.K. Whittaker, proposed that Ireland should be an open country that becomes a home for global firms to trade and do business from. And it takes decades then to realize the fruits of that ambition, but it needs to start with that ambition, and that ambition needs to be followed up with policy, whereby policy creates a business-friendly environment and maintains a business-friendly environment. So the thing that companies hate is uncertainty. So when a policy pivots on a dime, or there's the risk of that happening, that's a real problem, particularly for higher value industries. So that means governments and successive governments, and also the populations of country, which is often forgotten, realizing that the trade-offs of having a very strong economic policy is a lot of personal wealth coming to the country over time, the ability to pay for social services. So that whole whole of country backing for policy is hugely for good industry policy is hugely important, and then putting investment behind it. So Enterprise Ireland is one of two large enterprise agencies on our island. We focus on Irish companies that are exporting and trading globally. IDA Ireland, where I worked for 8 years, focuses on attracting foreign direct investment to Ireland. I'd say both pound for pound, and we would say this in the quality of the agencies that we are. There are a few around the world that could match the level of investment made by the Irish government and the level of focus that we represent. But I think those are the things I keep coming back to stability every time someone asks me the question, and it's very hard. I mean, it's hard to maintain policy stability over multi-decades that continues to support in the way it does. I think where things need to change, then doing that in a measured way so that industry feels at least there are lead-in times to changes and that there are no surprises that could have been avoided.
Right. Okay. You mentioned stability. That's certainly one thing, but also funding. We've also talked about green as an alternative business model. How do you see schemes like the IRA in the US and the European Green Deal helping develop local industry to make that digital or that green transition? How can things be produced sustainably but remain competitive? Generally, it's more expensive. Does funding need to be in place, or can it be done with another model?
Yeah, funding, it certainly helps. I was fortunate enough to be in Washington for the Select USA conference this year, which is the inward investment conference for the US. And I heard a lot of US policymakers speak about the Inflation Reduction Act and the other economic measures from the US. And there's huge federal weight behind this. But I was very impressed, actually, back to the last point on stability, that every governor that I heard and every federal official spoke about broadly the same things, regardless of their background or politics. They were very supportive of industry, of skills, of economic development, and had relatively similar agendas. So I think it's a very interesting suite of measures. A lot of the instruments are by nature of debt and investment. Not so much direct grants. There are huge amounts of direct grants, but not so much. The worry I would have is, I wonder how sustainable it is to maintain competitiveness through grant funding. I think you can grant funding usually is a good measure to help overcome the startup inefficiencies.
Yeah.
But they won't maintain. It shouldn't be an instrument that long term subsidizes an industry, because that's I believe false economy for government and is unsustainable over time. So that's the worry I have. The other way, even on the way in, deadweight risk is a huge item as well. So deadweight, for those who may be listening that don't know, it is the risk of subsidizing something that would have happened anyway in the absence of the subsidy. And I think that's a real risk for governments, that we would spend money on things that might have happened anyway, that could have been put to better productive use on things that mightn't have happened without it. So, but that's a risk whenever a government funds anything, whether that's Europe, US, or anywhere else in the world. It's certainly a risk. I think long term, we need to be examining ways to make green technologies more competitive and more cost competitive, particularly energy. I do have a worry that the cost of electrification and the ongoing cost of electricity supply is potentially too high for industry and consumers ultimately at the moment, and the continued technological development. So if I was, and I am to some extent personally investing in technologies that reduce the long-term cost of energy are probably the ones I would back most closely in this revolution.
Yeah. You have a worry about the cost. I have a worry about how green some of these technologies actually are. Like when you start, I saw an article the other day, for instance, in Argentina on the lithium mining there and the devastation of the communities and the water and everything that's going on there. My worry is when people start looking at these green technologies in more depth, that they're going to see that it's actually not that great after all. I
think that's where company, the parallel track to that that gives me some hope is that I see companies increasingly taking their ESG responsibilities more seriously and being audited more seriously on those. So if you have a supply chain that's dirty, immoral, poor sourcing, poor labor practices, is ruining environments, that will surface. I don't think that's sustainable for a long time. But again, fixing that is the right thing to do, and then it goes back to that becomes very probably more expensive. So I think we need to continue to make sure that ESG principles are embedded in every company's consciousness. Now, I think we've been waiting for a long time for consumers to prioritize ESG and sustainability. And I think given the inflation shock of the last year, I do worry that consumers won't be as sustainability conscious as they were 2 years ago, because they're now just fighting to survive in terms of monthly paychecks, paying for what they need to survive.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously, as an organization, Enterprise Island, you as you rightly say, you can choose what you fund, or you can choose what you're focusing on. What are you focusing on within Ireland? Which industries are you looking to attract in Ireland or to support in Ireland? Is it data centers? Is it biotech? Where do you really see the future of Ireland in terms of trade?
I think it's high skill, high value industry. We have a great base of life sciences, data centers, semiconductors, both manufacturing and services, increasingly services. We've got a good base across tech, life sciences, engineering, construction. I think sustainability businesses, we talked about them earlier, we're prioritizing very hard that we would help shape the next generation of sustainability leaders out of Ireland. We've got some great companies in that regard. So that's one sectoral trend. The other one is continuing that shift from manufacturing to either servitization of some of the products that come out of our manufacturing supply chains, or pure play services businesses that can scale fast. So those are some of the things we're focused on right now.
Okay. Final question, Leo. Always interested in the person that we're talking to. I'm just interested, are there any achievements or hobbies or passions which you sort of bring to the role at Enterprise Island?
Yeah, a couple of odd ones. So I'm an engineer by profession. I think that helps. I'm an electronic engineer, so it kind of helps to have an appreciation of tech trends, even if I'm no expert in nearly anything anymore after 15 years as a professional manager. My hobby is running. I find getting out to run and clearing your head and having that space to think is just, there's nothing to replace that. I kind of have to mention, because at the time it is, I have a huge interest in rugby, and we are now, as we enter the World Cup next Friday, Ireland is ranked #1 in the world, so we have our fingers crossed for the next couple of months. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Absolutely phenomenal results, and strangely enough, I'm a triathlete as well. I'm almost 50 now, so it's a bit late in the day to be getting into that. But yeah, I completely agree with clearing your head, getting out in the countryside, running, getting your heart rate up. It does something.
Yeah. Sure
okay,
does.
Wonderful. So Leo, thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Thanks to everyone listening in. I was in a conversation here with Leo Clancy, of the CEO of Enterprise Island. Leo, your participation is greatly appreciated. Thank you once more, and stay tuned for such interesting episodes on Disruption Dialogues.
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks for tuning in. If you want to know how you can navigate and thrive in this disruptive era, subscribe to Disruption Dialogues on your go-to podcast channels and stay tuned for more interesting episodes.